Hello, my name is Michael Smith. I'm the director of the National Model Aviation Museum here at the Academy of Model Aeronautics. Here at the end of September 2017 with Mr. Bob Sifleet to discuss the NATs that he participated in and won the Open National Champion as well as the Grand Champion. We're going to talk about the trophies behind us here and the NATs for 1966. This was Bob's third Grand National Champion win. Leading up to this, you had won in 1960 and in 62. So what happened between 62 and 66 in terms of your modeling?
Well, for a couple of years I didn't do very much. I was finishing up school because I had started college 5 years after I graduated from high school, so I wanted to get it done and get it done right, so I didn't have a lot of time to do modeling. And when I graduated, well, then I moved to Baltimore, Maryland, where I joined the Baltimore Aircraftsman Club, with a very good group of free flight guys, and started to build more airplanes and do more competing. And I did compete in the 65 NATs in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. And I entered high point events, but somewhere along the line I had a couple bad scores. I can't remember. But at any rate, I did compete that year. But then in for 66, I decided I'd go back to Chicago.
Yeah, because the 66 NATs were going to be at Glenview Naval Air Station again.
And I was going to be at in the week preceding that NATS was the team selection for the free flight events for a world championship team. And I had competed up at, Bong Field in Wisconsin, which is just north of Chicago a ways. Though I was there the previous week flying. So I figured, well, I can do all this in one trip. So I decided I would go ahead and enter the NATS.
Well, that worked out pretty good then for you.
Right, yeah.
What events did you fly then for 66?
Well, if I remember, it was half A, B, and C free flight, and I flew Mulva Hill, Wakefield, and half A speed and half A proto speed.
Do you remember what airplanes you took with you?
Well, I was still flying at that time the same designs I had at the 60 and 62 NATs for the AMA gas models. And in fact, in some cases with the same airplanes yet. But I had a good Wakefield model I had built, and I had built a new Mulva Hill model, and I'd built a proto-speed model because I'd kind of gotten away from flying control line stunt. And I figured it was easier just to fly a speed model that you don't need to do anything other than hang on to it. No practice involved.
So you didn't fly stunt then for 66?
No, I did not. I flew half A proto speed instead.
In terms of getting your points, did you had said previously that in control line stunt, that was a good way to get points.
Right.
Did that hamper your accumulating of points not flying stunt?
Well, you know, for stunt, I think my aerobatics airplane wore out and hadn't gotten around to building another one. So I just made a proto speed model, but I thought, well, maybe I wouldn't get quite as many points, but if the airplane flies okay, you still do all right, you know. Mm-hmm.
Now, where did you stay? Because obviously in the 62 NATs at Glenview, you were going to school there. Mm-hmm. What did you do then for the 66 NATs?
I stayed in the barracks.
Okay.
Well, there, they didn't use the barracks. They used a big gymnasium, huge gymnasium, and they filled it all up with double-deck bunks. It was cool.
Yeah, quite an experience.
Except if you stayed in the work hangar too long at night, you had to get a flashlight to be able to
find which one.
Rows of bunks. And that was kind of neat. I kind of like that.
Now, because at the Dallas one, you stayed in the barracks.
In the barracks, the regular barracks, yeah.
And did you share a room with someone?
Well, it'd be about 6 or 8 in a room. I think it was. You know, it wasn't a 1 or 2 man barracks. It was kind of a big room barracks with double deckers. You know, half a dozen or so of them in a room.
Right. So then at Glenview, it was just the gymnasium that they turned
gymnasium,
into the
huge gymnasium full of those.
And then for meals and so forth, you just
ate in the mess hall. I mean, well, the Navy was trying to encourage young modelers to get into naval aviation. That was the whole crux to the whole thing. Really.
a recruiting tool.
Yeah, it was a recruiting tool. I'm
Yes.
sure it was, as well as PR. They had PR dollars, so they spent it somewhere or another. So the mess hall was always good.
Made it a kind of a nice way to be then, to have there in the gymnasium your rooms and be able to go to the mess halls and so forth.
Right. And it always worked out good. And you saved a lot of money. You didn't have to stay in motels and stuff. You just stay in the, I forget what it was. It wasn't much to, you know, to have the meal ticket for every day and stay in the bunks. It wasn't very much.
Now, the flying conditions, how was the weather and so forth that year?
That was another good one. Again, you know, mid-August in the Midwest, you're going to have good weather for the most part. And I think that was a really good Nats. In fact, it was particularly calm, if I remember.
Now, do you think that given you had flown a previous Nats, do you think that helped you, that you knew the flying site?
Well, knowing the flying site always helps.
Made it a little easier in terms of being prepared. And
yeah, being prepared. You had some idea what you were faced with for the site.
Now, how did you pack your airplanes? You had mentioned when you went to Dallas, it was a 2.5-day trip, and you had your control line model in the back and the other models on top. Mm-hmm. What did you do to transport to this Nats in '66?
I believe, since I drove myself, and it didn't have the aerobatics airplane, the models were all just thrown in the trunk and the back seat loose. There was enough room for all the airplanes that I needed.
Now, did you go with anybody, just yourself?
No, there was a couple of members of the Aerocraftsmen that also went to the team selection, and they came down to the Nats. So I had a couple of buddies there, but I didn't travel with anybody.
Did you run into anybody as you were driving to the Nats?
No, I don't think so.
So it's just kind of, the 1960 was the one that you had mentioned you had kind of run into people on your way down.
Right,
yeah. For the events themselves, how did you do for the ones you flew?
Well, the memorable event was half A free flight. I won that. And I remember the night before, I went out and, like I always do, and test flew the model several times. I said, boy, this thing's really flying good. I am really happy with this thing. And so the morning of the event, half A used to be the most contested event at the Nats. You'd have 200 competitors in half A out there flying that morning. Well, it was more like a demolition derby. Half of the models were built the week before. So, you know, I went out and looked. I figured, I'm not even going to take my airplane out of the car yet. It was just, you know, wild. So I didn't even start flying until about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. And the crowd had dissipated somewhat, so I proceeded to make 3 5-minute maxes in half A free flight, and then you make an unlimited 4th flight. So I figured, well, you know, for high point, I've already scored 100 points because they only max out time was the most they would score you against. Fly off times they wouldn't count. So I figured, well, I'll go for broke, put a big fuse on the back, sent the model up, and it was really calm. Most of the flights that I flew, the first 3 flights, none of them went any more than a quarter mile. It didn't go very far. So I figured, well, I'll just put this thing on up there, and it goes up, and it's circling and circling and circling, and it goes over toward where a lot of the base buildings are and stuff. And there's some trees and stuff there, and there's a fence, and I couldn't get over the fence. So I saw the model flying, so I had to drive down and around, come back in. Sure enough, there it is, circling and circling and circling. And finally it DT'd and come down, and it lit on a road on the base rather than hitting anything. And I had done a 14-minute flight. I said, well, this ought to do good. Well, when the day was over, I won. I had the longest fly-off flight. And then Sal Taby of Starduster fame come over and shook my hand and congratulated me. He says, congratulations for winning and so on. But But I'm sorry that you weren't using. You were the only guy not flying a Starduster.
Do you remember what you were flying?
I was flying my half-A Maximus design.
Okay.
Because everybody was flying Stardusters because it was a, available kit. It was a pretty good airplane.
Why do you think that half-A event was so popular?
Well, everybody flew half-A.
It was just one of those that everybody flew.
Yeah.
Smaller airplane.
Yeah, just like everybody flies hand launch glider,
Mm-hmm.
in free flight. So it was always, half-A was always real popular.
Do you remember what in the high time flight, do you remember what the second place?
I really couldn't tell you. I'd have to find the old scores. And then, of course, there's a lot of stories for nationals, things that work for you or against you. You had Navy timers, and so the timing sometimes was questionable, other times very good. Well, I was flying Wakefield as one of the high point events. And I was winding from the back of my car. The back of the car, I had a stooge hooked up to it so I could wind the models. And a guy by the name of Hutchinson from California was helping me. He was competing with me, against me. But he was still helping me fly Wakefield. And, and there you make 7 flights. But they weren't flying by rounds. They were just flying, make your 7 flights and be done with it. So I started off, it must have been about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon to fly Wakefield that day. And so, you go get your Navy timer, and a timer comes and time you, and I'd flown 3 or 4, 5 flights, I guess, and I kept getting this old chief. And he was kind of a friendly guy and smiled a lot, and so on. And so I get him, I think, for the 6th flight. He comes over, and I wind up the model, and I throw it. And it wasn't very windy, and I was only going a third of a mile down the runway, and I was chasing with the car. So didn't make a real good flight. And it was, instead of 3 minutes, it must have made 2 minutes, 15 seconds, and it lit right by the runway. I was driving down there, it lit. So I picked it up, put it in the back seat together, turned around and come back to park where I had flew from. Well, just as I come, the chief was just walking back to the timer stand. And I pulled in and stopped, and Hutchinson come over and says, "Whew, you almost come back too quick. You just shut the watch off."
So he had not stopped when
so I don't know what he had him timing.
Oh, that was interesting.
So there's always stories about nationals.
Now, you mentioned that you were chasing your airplane in your car. Was basically everybody, what were people using to chase their airplanes? Like if there were that many people flying half-A.
There were some people using motorcycles then, but not many. It had just become, I think the year before, 65 in Willow Grove, the first person to ever chase with a motorcycle that I ever saw, and particularly at the Nationals, was Betty Bell from Florida. She chased with a motorcycle. So it began to grow, but in 66, there weren't many people. You either chased with a car or you walked.
That made a lot of people wandering off in all directions. And
yeah, but a lot of people use a car to chase with.
Yeah. And in terms of being on the base and everything, it's a far cry, obviously, from the security levels of the base that we've got today. So it would have been a case of you were on the base and you just drove to where you needed to go and chased your airplane?
Yeah. Basically didn't need to leave the base. And the only time you left the base was the first day of the Nats, was indoor. And you'd go to the indoor site at any of the Nats, wherever it was. In Chicago, they flew at the Madison Street Armory on the south side of Chicago.
And was that for both years it was there when you were flying in 62 and 66?
Yeah, that's where they flew indoor, yeah.
And how was that in comparison to other places?
Well, it was nice, but nothing like the dirigible hangars in Lakehurst, because that's where we flew in. See, I flew there in 57, and then '65, flew at Lakehurst at the big dirigible hangar. And that was neat.
Quite an experience.
Yeah. And in Dallas, we flew at Will Rogers Coliseum in Dallas, and big arena type thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, overall, how did you do in '66 for the different events?
Well, I won half A,
Mm-hmm.
got second in FAI power, and trying to think I don't think there was any other first three placings, but those were notable ones anyway.
Now, were there anyone in particular that you were competing against in terms of ones that you knew were placing well alongside you?
Well, I can't remember him. I think Roger Simpson was trying pretty hard, and he had won it a couple times subsequent. No, I think he won it in '65. Roger Simpson won it in '65, and he was trying again in '66. But I don't remember any others. Well, for the most part, you don't even know who, because they never posted the doggone things, unless you knew somebody that said,
right.
Yeah, I'm doing it. You didn't know.
So it's more just a matter of keeping track of yourself and knowing how you're doing.
Knowing how you're doing, yeah.
And then you said the final day, so would it be the Sunday then when they came and made the announcement and tried to find you?
Yeah, that's what they do. They'd come looking for you.
Uh-huh.
Because they knew several hours ahead of time.
Right.
Because I think about the only thing they actually flew on Sunday was, just a couple of events and control line scale and that type of thing. Because the base was full of people and you're getting ready for an air show. So,
right.
You're not going to do a lot.
Now, when they came and told you that you had won the third time, what were your thoughts?
Well, I say success again. And, met the challenge. And I was kind of hungry because I didn't do any good at the team selection the week before.
Oh, goodness.
So that makes you hungrier and work a little harder.
And how did you feel? You had said that you felt very lucky because you really hadn't prepared for the '62 win. For the '66, you had a gap of a few years, obviously, between the '62 and the '66.
Well, I had a couple of years in there after I graduated from college, to build more airplanes and do more flying, and things were working, and you know what you can do.
So between the 3 years that you had won, did you notice that your flying had improved?
Well, I would have liked to thought so anyway.
Had your scores improved?
I think so. Overall, I think I was doing better.
And then for the awarding, it was once again the grand national trophy was at the air show, where the rest of the trophies were all at the dinner that Sunday night.
Right. Yeah.
So again, you were in front of all of the crowd and everything, and were awarded the trophies.
Right. So, but that was an interesting another interesting story. An old friend of mine from Toledo, Roland Anderson, and he was flying Mova Hill. And he had maxed out in Mova Hill, wanted to make the fourth flight. And it was late in the afternoon, must have been 3 o'clock or so, maybe 3:30. And he recruited me to help him chase this thing on the unlimited flight. And I had finished up with that day's flying. He said, Bob, help me chase this thing. So he wound it up and launched it with great big long fuse out the back end. And off it goes in a nice thermal. Didn't climb real fast, but just kept going up and up, little at a time. So off we go in his car. Well, it's going that odd direction to where you can't get off the base easy. And the model's going this way, and the gate's way back here, 3/4 of a mile back, and you got to drive around to get. And they said, well, if we go back, we'll just lose sight of this thing. So he's looking at his airplane, and his father, Doc Anderson, was with us. He said, how are we going to get this thing? And Doc says, well, look, he was a pretty stout guy. He says, well, let me stand up next to the fence. It's one of the those fences,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll get him up over and pitch him over the fence. Then he can go get it. Well, we managed to achieve that. So I'm on the ground on the other side of the fence, and Raul says, well, you go after it, and when you get it, just go to the nearest intersection and wait for me to find you. So I started running off across 2 residential areas and going and going and going, and being not too windy, I was able to keep up with the airplane. It finally dethermalized. It had like a 15-minute fuse on it, and it come down, and his official time was like 17 and a half minutes. They timed the thing, and he won Mulva Hill.
Wow.
With the airplane. So I was only maybe 2 blocks from it when it lit. So I walked around, and it was in somebody's vegetable garden, and I got the airplane, and I went out, and I said, well, here's an intersection and a tree. So I was going to sit down under this tree and wait. Well, I waited.
Yeah, no cell phone or anything then.
No cell phone,
Yes.
no nothing. And waited. It must have been 40 minutes. And all of a sudden, a car comes around the corner, comes to a screeching halt. Raul opens up the door and comes out, and he says, you got it, you got it.
Yeah, were you successful? That was the important thing.
Yeah. I told him, no problem.
So how, for that flight, how were the judges, were they just watching it? I mean, they didn't have...
watch it with binoculars.
Okay.
You know, they had 2 guys timing it for a fly-off flight, and they saw it for 17 and a half minutes, something like that. It was really only about 2.5 miles away when it lit, so it wasn't that far.
Mm-hmm. Pretty impressive flight, though.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
But he returned the favor in 72, it was 73. He gave me the plans for his airplane, and I built one, and then in 73 I won Mulva Hill at the Nats, and he helped me with the same design.
So he helped you chasing the airplane.
Oh, yeah, yeah, he helped me chase, do everything, yeah.
Fantastic. Now, we have the trophies here. We have the Open National Champion and the Grand National Champion. As you said, there were 3 National Champion trophies, the Open, the Junior, and the Senior.
Right.
And then the high points from each one of those was who they looked at then for the Grand Champion.
That's right.
And you were awarded this then at the air show.
Air show, right.
And you said in 62 you had displayed the trophies back at your hobby shop that you
Right.
had worked at.
Right.
What did you do with the trophies then after you won in 66?
Well, let's see, I was still single then. I didn't get married till the next year. They just ended up in the spare bedroom in the apartment that I was renting. And that was it.
Okay. Again, this was the 3rd time you had won. What did your friends and family think this year?
Well, my parents said, oh, he did it again. Of course, the guys in the Baltimore Craftsman, they, had praise and everything else, and they felt pretty happy that I had achieved this as a member of their club.
Brought some notoriety to their club that you were a member of that club.
Club, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is there anything else that you can think of in terms of your memories of the 66 Nats?
Well, I think I covered the high points anyway.
How did it overall, in terms of these 3 wins, which one did you, which one meant the most to you?
Well, I think the first one is always means the most.
You had been able to achieve that goal.
That plateau,
Yeah.
that really meant the most, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with us today and talking about the 1966 Nats.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you.